What would you do if you saw a wolf standing over a helpless baby in the snow? Would you scream? Would you run? Most people would assume the worst. And honestly, that reaction makes complete sense. Wolves are wild animals. They are powerful, unpredictable, and ruled by instinct. But here's the thing. Instinct doesn't always work the way we think it does. And what happened in that frozen moment challenges everything we believe about the relationship between humans and the animal kingdom. You've probably grown up hearing the stories. The big bad wolf, the creature that lurks at the edge of the forest, the predator that you never ever turn your back on. Those stories have been passed down for centuries, and they're not entirely wrong. Wolves are apex predators. They are built to hunt. But nature is far more complex than our fairy tales give it credit for. And what science has been uncovering about wolves, about survival instincts, and about the unexpected bonds that form between species might just rewrite everything you thought you knew. Have you ever stopped to ask yourself why certain animals choose not to attack, even when every biological signal is telling them to? This is where it gets fascinating, because that wolf, standing in the snow beside a crying infant, didn't just walk away. What it did, and what researchers and wildlife experts have spent years trying to explain, points to something profound about the nature of compassion, territory, and what biologists now call cross-species protective behavior. It sounds like something out of a myth, a legend, the kind of story your grandmother might have whispered to you at bedtime. But this isn't folklore. This is documented. This is real. And if you've ever felt a deep, almost unexplainable connection to animals, what you're about to discover might finally tell you why. We're going to look at the science behind these moments. We're going to explore what was really happening inside that wolf's mind, if mind is even the right word, and what it reveals about the invisible threads that connect all living creatures. You already know there's something more going on. That gut feeling you have when you look into an animal's eyes and sense something there, something aware. Science is finally catching up to what many of us have always felt intuitively. So stay with me, because what you're about to learn isn't just about wolves and babies in the snow. It's about survival. It's about instinct. It's about the moments when nature surprises us so completely that we have no choice but to look at the world differently. The wolf didn't attack. And the reason why, you're about to find out. And before we go any further, I want to take just a moment, not to pause the story, but to deepen it. Because the truth is, you being here right now, watching this, tells me something about you. It tells me that you're someone who looks at the world with curiosity. Someone who doesn't settle for the surface-level explanation. Someone who, when they hear about a wolf standing over a baby in the snow, doesn't just scroll past. They stop, and they ask why. That's rare. And I genuinely mean that. So if this story is already stirring something inside you, whether it's wonder, disbelief, or that quiet feeling that maybe the natural world is far more connected than we give it credit for, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever witnessed an animal behave in a way that completely surprised you? A moment that made you think that shouldn't be possible? Those stories matter. Every single one of them. And honestly, reading your experiences in the comments is one of the most powerful parts of doing this. It reminds me, and everyone watching, that we're not alone in feeling this deep, almost unexplainable pull toward the animal world. And if this kind of content speaks to you, if you believe that these stories deserve to be told and heard by more people, there are two small things that make an enormous difference. Hit the like button. It sounds simple, almost too simple, but that one tap is what tells the algorithm that this story is worth sharing, that it deserves to reach someone else who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. This channel exists because people like you chose to stay, chose to come back, chose to say, yes, I want more of this. Every new subscriber is another voice added to this community, and every voice makes the next story possible. This isn't about numbers. It's about building something real, a space where curiosity is celebrated, where nature is respected, and where stories like this one don't get buried under clickbait and noise. Your presence here is what keeps that alive. So thank you. Truly. Now, let's get back to the wolf. The wolf didn't attack, and the reason why will change the way you see nature forever. Picture this. Close your eyes for just a moment. Or don't. Because you'll want to take in every word of what comes next. Imagine a forest in the dead of winter. Not the kind of winter you see in photographs, all soft and romantic with delicate snowflakes drifting through golden light. This is something else entirely. This is the kind of cold that has weight to it. The kind that presses against your skin like a hand, slow and relentless, pulling the warmth from your body 1 degree at a time. The air is so sharp it cuts when you breathe. Every inhale feels like swallowing glass. The trees stand like silent sentinels, their branches heavy and bowed under the accumulated weight of snow that has been falling for days. Some of those branches have surrendered entirely, snapped under the pressure, leaving jagged wounds in the bark that will take years to heal. The sky above is the color of old iron. Not quite gray, not quite white, but something flat and final, as though the sun made a decision some time ago to simply stop trying. There is no wind. That is perhaps the strangest part. In a storm like this, you expect movement, chaos, the howling that folklore has always associated with dangerous places. But there is none of that. There is only stillness. The kind of stillness that doesn't feel peaceful. It feels loaded, held, like the entire forest is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen that it already knows is coming. The snow on the ground is undisturbed, a seamless white canvas that stretches in every direction, with no horizon line to speak of, just white meeting white until your eyes give up trying to find the edge. The silence is so complete that it almost has a sound of its own, a low, vibrating hum that lives just below the threshold of hearing, felt more in the chest than in the ears. This is the landscape. This is the world into which everything that follows was born. And somewhere in the middle of it, nestled against the root system of a fallen oak, half buried in snow that had drifted against the trunk during the night, there was a baby, a human baby, impossibly small, wrapped in cloth that had once been thick and warm, but was now soaked through, heavy with cold, clinging to the child's skin in a way that was doing more harm than good at this point. The baby's face was red, flushed with the effort of crying, which it had been doing for what the searchers who later pieced this story together estimated was at least 2 hours, maybe more, long enough for the sound to have traveled, long enough for something in the forest to have heard. The fingers were curled into tiny fists, as they tend to be when a very small child is in distress, that involuntary grasping motion, reaching for something that isn't there, searching for contact, for warmth, for the particular smell of someone familiar. There was none of that. There was only the snow, and the iron sky, and the silence, and the cold that kept coming. How the child ended up there is a question that belongs to a different part of this story. What matters right now is this. The baby was alone, completely and utterly alone, in one of the most inhospitable environments a human body can find itself in. Medical science tells us that an infant in those conditions, exposed, wet, temperatures well below freezing, has a window of survival measured not in hours, but in minutes. The body simply doesn't have the reserves. The thermoregulatory systems aren't fully developed. A grown adult with training and experience can survive conditions like that for a time, can make decisions, can move, can build, can fight. A baby cannot do any of those things. A baby can only cry. And cry it did. The sound moved through the trees like something alive, high and sharp and desperate in the way that only the cry of a very young child can be. There is something in that particular frequency that bypasses rational thought entirely and connects directly to something ancient and instinctual, deep in the human nervous system. People who have studied infant vocalizations describe it as an evolutionary alarm signal, something refined over hundreds of thousands of years to be virtually impossible to ignore. It works on adults of every culture, every language, every background. It even, researchers have found, produces measurable stress responses in adults who have never had children, who have no personal connection to the sound at all. The cry of a baby in distress is one of the most universally activating sounds in the biological world. It is a signal that says simply, something is wrong. Something is very wrong, and it needs to be fixed right now. The forest heard it. And then, from somewhere deep within the tree line, something began to move. You have to understand something about the way a wolf moves through snow before you can fully appreciate what happened next. Wolves are extraordinarily efficient travelers. Their gait is designed for endurance. They can cover enormous distances at a steady, ground-eating trot that barely disturbs the surface beneath them. Their paws are wide and act almost like natural snowshoes, distributing their weight across a broader surface area so they don't sink as deeply as you might expect. And crucially, they are quiet. Remarkably, unsettlingly quiet for an animal of their size. A wolf moving through a snow-covered forest doesn't crunch or crash or announce itself. It flows. It appears. One moment there is nothing, and then there is a shape between the trees, and the shape has eyes, and the eyes are looking directly at you. This wolf was a male, large, even by the standards of his species, with a coat that had thickened into something truly impressive over the course of the winter. A layered combination of dense undercoat and longer guard hairs that shed water and insulated against temperatures that would be fatal to most mammals. His coloring was the particular grey-brown of old wood, with lighter markings around the muzzle and a darkness along the ridge of his back that deepened toward black in the fading light. He moved at a walk, not a stalk. Wolves stalk prey with a low, compressed energy, head down, weight shifted forward, every muscle coiled. This was something different. He walked upright, head carried level, ears rotating like small satellite dishes, tracking the sound that had drawn him here. His breath misted in the cold air, in slow, regular clouds. He was not running. He was not afraid. He was simply coming. The psalm. People of the nearby settlement, a small village whose name appears in the regional records of the area with an orthography that has changed several times over the decades, had sent out a search party when the baby was discovered missing. 3 men and a woman, all experienced in winter travel, all dressed for conditions that would have stopped anyone less prepared. They were moving through the forest from the eastern edge, following tracks in the snow that had already been partially filled in by drifting. They were perhaps 400 meters away when they crested a small rise in the terrain and stopped. Below them, in a shallow natural depression formed by the roots of the fallen oak, they could see the baby, and they could see the wolf. He had arrived first. By how much, they couldn't say. The tracks didn't give a clear enough picture in that area, where the snow had been disturbed by both the child's presence and what came next. But he was there, and he was close, and everyone of the searchers later described the same first reaction. Absolute, paralytic terror. The kind that doesn't scream, doesn't move, doesn't do anything at all. The kind that simply shuts the body down while the mind tries to process what the eyes are showing it. The wolf was standing over the baby, not attacking, not feeding, standing. His massive head was lowered and he was... And this is the detail that every person present struggled to describe because the word felt wrong, felt too human, felt like an imposition of meaning onto something that resisted meaning. He was sniffing, slowly, carefully, moving his nose in a deliberate arc across the baby's face, its neck, its wrapped body, the way a doctor might move a stethoscope, methodical and attentive. The baby had gone quiet. Whether from shock or cold or something else entirely, the searchers couldn't tell. It had simply stopped crying. And in the silence left behind, the only sound was the faint exhalation of the wolf's breath, a slow, rhythmic misting in the frozen air above the child's face. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. One of the men later said that he had his hand on the hunting knife at his belt for the entire duration of what followed, but that he never drew it. Not because he wasn't afraid. He was profoundly, but because some wordless instinct told him that any sudden movement would transform a situation he didn't understand into one he definitely didn't want. The wolf looked up. He looked directly at the four, people standing on the rise above him. His eyes caught what little light remained in that flat grey sky and held it, and for a moment, just a moment, there was eye contact. Real, direct, mutual eye contact of the kind that neuroscientists now tell us activates social cognition in both humans and certain animals, the same neural circuits that process faces and intentions and the inner lives of other beings. The wolf held that gaze for what the witnesses described as 3, maybe 4 seconds. Then, without apparent hurry, without any sign of alarm, he lowered himself to the ground. He lay down next to the baby. His large body curved slightly inward, forming a crescent shape against the root system of the fallen oak. The baby was in the hollow of that crescent, not quite touching the wolf but close enough to be within the radius of his body heat. And a wolf's body heat, in winter conditions, is substantial. The fur along his flank was thick enough that even in air temperatures this severe, the surface temperature of his coat would have been warm to the touch. The baby, whose core temperature must have been dropping by this point in a way that would have become irreversible very soon, was now inside a circle of warmth. The crying did not resume. One of the searchers, the woman, later described what she saw next as the thing that stayed with her for the rest of her life. Not the initial shock, not the terror of watching a predator stand over a human child, but what came after. What came after, she said, was a stillness between the two of them, the wolf and the baby, that felt less like the absence of movement and more like the presence of something she couldn't name, something that didn't fit inside the vocabulary she had for the relationship between wild animals and human beings. The baby's hand, that tiny fisted hand that had been reaching and grasping at empty air since long before anyone arrived, slowly opened and rested against the wolf's fur. The searchers descended the rise carefully, slowly, making no sudden movements. The wolf watched them come. He didn't stand. He didn't growl. He didn't do any of the things that a wolf is supposed to do when humans approach in threatening proximity. He simply watched with those steady, unreadable eyes as the four people reached the depression, reached the baby, reached out with careful hands, and lifted the child from the ground. One of the men positioned himself between the wolf and the rest of the group as they began to move away, a protective instinct that made perfect sense but turned out to be unnecessary. The wolf remained where he was, lying in the snow beside the impression left by the baby's body, watching them go. They didn't look back after the first 50 meters, partly from fear and partly, though none of them would admit this until years later, because looking back felt like it would break something, like turning around would violate some unspoken agreement that had been made in that hollow between the roots, in the cold, in the silence. The baby survived. Mild hypothermia, some frostbite on the extremities, but alive. The attending physician noted in the case record that the child's core temperature, while dangerously low, had not crossed the threshold that typically precedes organ failure. Given the conditions and the estimated exposure time, this outcome was, his word, improbable. The village talked about nothing else for weeks, and then the real questions began. Because here is where the story shifts from remarkable to something that I genuinely don't have a clean word for. Something that sits in the space between the explainable and the inexplicable and refuses to move into either camp. When the searchers returned to the site the following morning, partly to retrieve some equipment they had abandoned in the rush to get the baby to warmth, and partly because human beings are drawn back to the places where their understanding broke down, they found the tracks. Not just the wolf's tracks from the previous day, and not just the tracks of the search party. There were older tracks too. Much older, based on the degree to which they had been filled and compressed by the ongoing snowfall. Tracks that told a story of movement that nobody had pieced together until that moment, standing in the cold with the iron sky overhead and the silence pressing in from all sides. The wolf had not come from deeper in the forest when the baby began to cry. He had been circling the area for hours, maybe longer. The pattern of the tracks, and a local wildlife expert who was brought in to examine the site, spent the better part of a morning reconstructing what he could before additional snowfall erased the evidence entirely, suggested a behavior that was less consistent with hunting or territorial marking and more consistent with what researchers in animal behavior describe as sentinel behavior. Watching over, standing guard. The kind of sustained, deliberate proximity to a location that you see in pack animals when they are monitoring something of importance to the group, a den site, a kill, a vulnerable member. The wolf had been there before the baby arrived. Let that settle for a moment. Because this is the detail that changes everything. This is not a story about a predator that happened upon a helpless creature, and for reasons science might eventually explain through some mechanism of confused maternal signaling or misfiring threat assessment, simply failed to attack. That would be remarkable enough on its own, and there is in fact a substantial body of research on exactly those kinds of interactions. Cases where large predators approach human infants or small children and do not behave as expected, which scientists have attributed to everything from cross-species infant recognition to simple curiosity to the suppression of predatory drive in the presence of a non-fleeing target. Those explanations are real, and they are valid, and they deserve their own deep exploration, which we will absolutely give them. But they don't cover this. Because this wolf wasn't there by accident. He wasn't passing through and paused by an unusual sound. He was already there, positioned, oriented, present in a way that the physical evidence suggested was intentional, sustained, and specific to that location at that time, before any of the circumstances that would later make his presence meaningful had even unfolded. This is where the scientific community begins to fracture into different camps, and honestly, listening to the debate is one of the most fascinating intellectual journeys you can take if you're willing to follow the thread wherever it leads. The conventional framework insists on coincidence. The wolf was in the area for reasons entirely unrelated to the baby, a prey trail, a territorial boundary, a resting spot. The subsequent behavior, while unusual, falls within the documented range of wolf responses to non-threatening novel stimuli. The circling pattern was misread, or the timeline was imprecise, or the snow conditions made older tracks appear fresher than they were. This is the skeptical position, and it is not without merit. Science is built on skepticism. The default assumption in the absence of controlled observation should always be that the mundane explanation is more likely than the extraordinary one. But then there's the other camp, and the other camp points to something that has been quietly accumulating in the literature on animal cognition and sensory perception for the past 2 decades. A body of evidence so consistently surprising that even the researchers producing it sometimes seem uncomfortable with the implications. The growing understanding of what animals actually perceive, what information they have access to that we don't, is one of the most genuinely mind-expanding frontiers in modern science. And when you understand what a wolf's senses actually do, the question of whether he could have known something was coming before it arrived becomes a great deal more complicated than it first appears. Start with smell, because smell is where the wolf's sensory world diverges most dramatically from ours. A human being has roughly 5 to 6 million olfactory receptors in the nasal passages. This sounds like a lot until you learn that a wolf has somewhere between 200 and 300 million. The wolf's brain dedicates approximately 1/3 of its total volume to processing olfactory information. Compare that to the human brain, where the olfactory processing region is roughly the size of a postage stamp. What this means in practical terms is that a wolf doesn't just smell the world the way we do, picking up strong or nearby odors and occasionally catching faint ones on a good day. A wolf reads the world through smell the way we read it through vision, in full, detailed, dynamic, continuously updating. Information about everything within a radius that can extend for miles under the right atmospheric conditions. Wind direction, humidity levels, the specific chemical signatures that animals, including humans, produce under conditions of stress, cold exposure, illness, fear, physical exertion. A wolf moving through a landscape is constantly processing an invisible three-dimensional map of everything that has happened there and everything that is currently happening, updated in real time with every breath. A human baby in severe cold stress produces a very specific biochemical signature. The physiological responses to hypothermia, the hormonal cascade, the metabolic shifts, the particular combinations of compounds released through skin and breath, and the slight elevation in certain volatile organic compounds that occurs as the body begins to triage its resources, these produce a smell. A smell that is not the same as a healthy infant smell, not the same as an adult in distress, and not the same as any number of other things in a winter forest that might draw a predator's attention. It is specific. And a wolf at sufficient range, in the right wind conditions, reading that signature against the clean white background of winter air, would know, with a precision and certainty that our own sensory apparatus simply cannot approximate, that something was there, that it was small, that it was in trouble, and roughly where it was. Could a wolf detect a baby in hypothermic distress from a distance of several kilometers? The honest answer, based on what we currently know about lupine olfactory capabilities and the atmospheric conditions typically present in that kind of winter environment, is yes. Almost certainly yes. The wolf didn't need mystical foresight to be in that area before the baby arrived. He needed a nose and a wind coming from the right direction, and those are both things wolves reliably have. But here is where I want to go deeper, because the smell is only part of it. The smell explains the detection. It doesn't explain the behavior. There is a distinction in animal behavior research between approach and protective proximity, and it is not a subtle one. An animal that detects a potential food source approaches differently than an animal that detects something it wants to investigate, which is itself different from an animal that positions itself in a specific relationship to a location and maintains that position over time. The track pattern at this site, the sustained circling, the maintained distance, the orientation, is not consistent with hunting approach behavior. It's not consistent with curiosity-driven investigation. What it is consistent with, according to the wildlife expert who examined the site and several colleagues he later consulted, is the kind of behavior you observe in wolves when they are responding to vulnerability in a way that activates what researchers call the caregiving system rather than the predatory system. Yes, wolves have a caregiving system. Of course they do. They are intensely social animals with a highly developed pack structure that depends on the successful rearing of vulnerable young. The behaviors associated with caring for pups, the attentiveness, the protective positioning, the tolerance of vulnerability that would in other contexts trigger predatory response, are deeply wired. And one of the most fascinating and troubling and wonderful discoveries in recent animal cognition research is that these systems can be activated across species lines under the right conditions. The signal doesn't always need to come from a wolf pup. The signal needs to be like a wolf pup, small, vulnerable, in distress, non-threatening, producing the biochemical and acoustic signatures associated with a young animal that needs help. A human infant, particularly one in the kind of severe physical stress this baby was in, produces signals that overlap enough with those of a wolf pup in distress to potentially activate exactly those responses. The cry frequency, the chemical stress markers, the smallness of the target relative to the responding animal, the non-threatening posture. These are all inputs into a system that, in the right animal under the right circumstances, can respond in ways that look, from the outside, remarkably like compassion. This is not a metaphor. It is not anthropomorphization. It is neuroscience. The caregiving system and the predatory system are not simply different modes. They are, in important ways, opposing modes. When one is activated, it actively suppresses the other. A wolf in full caregiving response to perceived vulnerability is not just less likely to attack, it is neurobiologically in a state where attack becomes difficult in the same way that other competing drives become difficult to act on when a more dominant drive has taken over. The wolf lying in the snow beside the baby was not making a choice in the way we use that word. He was not weighing options, calculating outcomes, deciding that kindness was preferable to hunger. He was in the grip of something older and more absolute than decision-making, a biological imperative that had read the available information and produced a response that was, given those inputs, entirely appropriate. And yet I keep coming back to the circling, to the hours before, to the tracks in the snow that told a story of sustained presence before any of the circumstances that would explain it had occurred. Because even if we accept all of the above, the olfactory detection, the caregiving activation, the cross-species vulnerability response, even if we accept all of that as a complete and sufficient explanation for the wolf's behavior once the baby was present, we are still left with a timing problem. We are still left with the question of what the wolf was doing there, in that specific place, before the baby arrived. And this is the question that refuses to close. There is a category of animal behavior that researchers have historically been reluctant to engage with directly, because it sits uncomfortably close to claims that science has spent considerable effort distancing itself from. Call it anticipatory behavior. Call it pre-event positioning. Call it whatever term makes you most comfortable. It refers to documented cases, and there are more of them than most people realize, in which animals appear to orient themselves toward a location or situation before the event that would seem to explain that orientation has occurred. Dogs that wait by the door for owners whose return cannot be predicted by any known signal. Elephants that travel to the location where another elephant will die before that animal has shown any signs of illness. Birds that alter migratory patterns in ways that appear to anticipate weather events days before standard atmospheric indicators would make prediction possible. Science's response to these observations has generally been to look for the hidden signal, the infrasonic vibration, the barometric shift, the chemical trace, the behavioral cue so subtle that human observers missed it. And in many cases, that search has been successful. The hidden signal gets found. The mystery gets explained. The animal's apparent foreknowledge turns out to be extraordinary sensory processing of information that was always there, just below our ability to perceive it. But not always. There are cases in the literature, documented, peer-reviewed, replicated in controlled conditions, where the hidden signal cannot be found. Where the information that would have been needed for the animal's behavior to be explained through known sensory channels simply was not present in the environment at the relevant time. These cases are the ones that make certain researchers very uncomfortable and other researchers very excited, and the debate between those two groups is one of the most genuine and unresolved conversations happening at the frontier of animal cognition right now. I'm not going to tell you what to believe about this. That is not what this is for. What I want to do is put you inside the question the way I was put inside it the first time I encountered this story, and let the discomfort of it work on you the way it worked on me. Because the discomfort is information. The discomfort is the feeling of your existing model of reality being asked to expand, which is one of the most valuable sensations a thinking person can have. Now I want to go even deeper into this because what we've covered so far, as astonishing as it is really only the beginning of the picture. The wolf lying in the snow next to a human baby is a remarkable image, but it is not an isolated one. It is one data point in a pattern of human-animal interactions that once you start looking, you find scattered throughout history, across cultures, across continents, in documents and oral traditions and modern case files, and wildlife research databases, a pattern that suggests something about the relationship between our species and the predators that share our world that we have consistently failed to integrate into our understanding. Not because the evidence isn't there, but because the evidence, when taken seriously, requires us to revise something fundamental about the story we've been telling ourselves, about nature, about wildness, about the line between human and animal, and about what it means for two beings from completely different worlds to recognize something in each other across that line. The Roman histories record feral children. The mythology of dozens of unconnected cultures includes the motif of the wild animal that protects the abandoned infant. Romulus and Remus, yes, but also stories from Persia, from India, from the indigenous traditions of North and South America, from the oral histories of Central Asian nomadic cultures, from Africa. The she-wolf, nursing the founders of Rome, is the famous one, the one that made it into the textbooks, but it is not an outlier. It is an echo of something that kept happening often enough that human beings kept finding ways to record it, to give it sacred significance, to build entire founding myths around it. Anthropologists used to read these stories as pure invention, symbolic narratives about civilization's relationship to nature, about the liminal space between the human and the wild, and perhaps some of them are exactly that. Perhaps the Roman story is a political myth and nothing more, a founding narrative designed to give a people their sense of destiny. But what do we do with the cases that aren't myth? What do we do with the documented instances from the 19th and 20th centuries, cases examined by physicians, recorded in institutional files, photographed, followed up on, of children who were found living among wolves? Children who moved like wolves, communicated like wolves, had developed physical adaptations consistent with years of life in that environment. Kamala and Amala in India, the wolf children of Hesse. The case is compiled by the French physician Lucien Malson in his mid-20th century study of feral children, in which he documented over 50 cases drawn from verified historical records. These are not comfortable stories. The children, in almost every documented case, had extreme difficulty integrating into human society. The neurological window for certain kinds of learning and language, fine motor development, the particular calibration of social emotion that our species develops through human interaction in early childhood, appears to close at a certain point, and once it closes, it does not fully reopen. The children who were found having spent formative years among wolf packs did not, in most cases, become fully functional members of human communities. This is the tragedy inside the miracle, and it deserves to be named. But here is what the documented cases also show. The wolves, in virtually every instance where researchers could reconstruct the history, had not simply tolerated the child. They had incorporated the child into pack life, had fed the child, had kept the child warm, had apparently taught the child the behaviors necessary for survival in the pack's environment. The child, in the pack's apparent understanding, was a member. A strange one, slow and awkward, and physically weak by wolf standards, but a member nonetheless. Something in the pack structure had made space. How? Why? These are not questions with simple answers, and anyone who tells you they have a simple answer is selling something. What we do have are frameworks, partial understandings, pieces of a picture that grows more interesting the more of it you can see. One framework that has gained significant traction in recent decades is the concept of interspecies social bonding. The idea that the mechanisms underlying social attachment and group inclusion in highly social animals are not as species-specific as classical ethology assumed. That the same neural systems that bind a wolf to its packmates can, under certain conditions, extend to individuals from other species, creating what is functionally a social relationship with all the obligations and protections that implies. This framework was initially developed to explain the well-documented phenomenon of wolves and dogs forming genuine social bonds with human beings, which, in retrospect, seems obvious since we bred dogs specifically by selecting for animals that were capable of exactly that kind of cross-species bonding. But the research has since expanded to examine cases in which wild wolves, with no prior habituation to humans, display behaviors consistent with social recognition and social obligation toward human individuals. The conditions under which this appears to be most likely to occur are instructive. Vulnerability matters, smallness matters. The absence of threatening behavior matters. And perhaps most intriguingly, exposure during critical developmental windows appears to matter. both for the animal and, the research suggests, for the human. There are documented cases of wildlife researchers who spent extended periods of close fieldwork with wolf packs, reporting that the wolves appeared to adjust their behavior around them in ways consistent with social integration, not just habituation. The wolves stopped treating the researcher as a neutral environmental presence and started treating them as a known individual with a place in a social landscape. This is a qualitatively different thing, and the researchers who have experienced it describe it with a consistency and specificity that makes it difficult to dismiss. What all of this begins to suggest, and I want to be careful here because the suggestion is large and needs to be approached with appropriate care, is that the image of the wolf as the adversary, the predator at the edge of the fire, that represents everything threatening and wild and beyond the boundary of human civilization, is at best an incomplete picture. At worst, it is a picture that has cost us something, has cost us an understanding of our relationship to the natural world that was available to us, that certain human cultures maintained and others discarded in the process of building the particular kind of civilization we've built. Indigenous traditions around the world, and I say this not as romantic generalization, but as a documented ethnographic reality that holds across cultures as distinct from each other as the Lakota of the North American plains, the Evenki of Siberia, the Sami of northern Scandinavia, and the Ainu of Japan, maintained relational frameworks with wolves that positioned the two species not as adversaries but as parallel peoples, different in form, operating in the same territory, each with their own social structures and obligations and ways of being in the world, but related. Kin in some frameworks, teachers in others. The wolf as the animal that showed human beings how to hunt cooperatively before human beings had figured it out themselves. This is a narrative thread that appears in various forms in traditions spread across the Northern Hemisphere, traditions that had no contact with each other and yet arrived at remarkably similar conclusions about the nature of the relationship. Science has been slow to engage with this body of knowledge. There are reasons for that slowness that are partly legitimate. The scientific method requires testable hypotheses and controlled conditions, and traditional ecological knowledge doesn't always present itself in forms that are easy to test, and partly less legitimate, involving the kinds of institutional biases that the history of science is gradually and uncomfortably reckoning with. But the engagement is happening. Ethnoecology as a discipline has been growing steadily, and some of the most productive recent work in wolf behavioral research has come from collaborations between academic scientists and indigenous knowledge keepers who have been observing wolf behavior in specific landscapes for generations and have developed frameworks for understanding it that turn out, when tested against empirical evidence, to be remarkably accurate. What does it mean that a wolf lay down next to a dying baby in the snow? What does it mean that he was already there? What does it mean that the baby's hand opened and rested against his fur and the crying stopped? I don't think it means what the skeptic wants it to mean, which is nothing, a coincidence, a misfiring of instinct, an anomaly without implication. The evidence is too consistent, across too many cases, across too much of recorded history, to sustain that interpretation without a level of motivated disbelief that I think is itself worth examining. What are we protecting when we insist that this means nothing? What story about ourselves and our place in the world are we trying to preserve? But I also don't think it means what the romantic wants it to mean. It doesn't mean that wolves are gentle or safe, or that wildness is fundamentally benign and only made dangerous by human interference. Wolves are predators. They kill. The same animal that lay down next to that baby had almost certainly, in the days before and after, hunted and killed prey animals in ways that were brutal and efficient and entirely without sentiment. The wolf does not inhabit a morally simplified world. It inhabits the actual world, which is complex and contradictory and full of things that seem like they should be mutually exclusive but aren't. Maybe that is the most important thing to take from all of this. Not a lesson about wolves, specifically, but a lesson about complexity, about the danger of the single story, about what happens when we decide in advance what something is, what it can be, what it is allowed to mean, and then encounter evidence that refuses to fit inside that decision. The wolf in the snow refused to fit. He lay down in the gap between the story we tell about predators and the story that actually happened, and he stayed there, warm and steady, until the searchers came. And when they lifted the baby and carried it away, he watched. And then he was still. If any part of this story has moved you, if you felt something shift when you pictured that hand opening against the fur, or when you sat with the knowledge that he was already there, drop a comment below and write, "He was already there." Just that. Let's see how many of us felt it the same way. If you made it here, to this exact moment, to the end of this story, then you already know that you're not the kind of person who skims the surface. You stayed. You followed the thread all the way through the forest, through the snow, through the science and the history and the questions that don't have clean answers. That means something. It means this kind of content is made for you, and this channel exists because of people exactly like you. So if you haven't subscribed yet, this is the moment. Not because I'm asking you to do me a favor, but because what we explored today is just one story in a much larger conversation about nature, about instinct, about the invisible connections between living things that science is only beginning to articulate. There is more, a lot more, and I'd love for you to be here when it arrives. Drop a comment below and write, "I stayed until the end." That's all. It's a small thing, but it tells me that this reached someone, and honestly, that's the whole point. And if something in this video landed for you, if a particular moment made you pause or think or feel something you weren't expecting, the like button is the quietest way to say so. One tap. It carries more weight than it looks like it does. There's a video right next to this one that picks up exactly where this conversation leaves off. A different story, a different animal, but the same thread running underneath it. Click it and let's keep going.